The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. It was another busy Monday at the Franklin County Courthouse, with the usual shuffle of traffic violators, lawyers, and court officials filing in and out of the heavy oak doors. Harold Washington sat quietly in the back row, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap. At 72 years old, he carried himself with a dignity that seemed to belong to a different era. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and despite his age, his dark eyes remained sharp and alert, taking in every detail of his surroundings with quiet interest. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as various cases were called and dismissed. Young professionals in crisp suits checked their watches impatiently, while harried mothers tried to quiet their restless children. Harold simply waited, his expression unchanged, wearing a suit that had seen better days but was meticulously pressed. Case number 247, Harold Washington, called out the court clerk, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Approaching Judge Patricia Bennett for a traffic violation. Harold rose slowly, his movements deliberate but steady. As he made his way to the front of the courtroom, several people glanced at him with mild curiosity. An elderly black man in an old suit wasn't an unusual sight in traffic court, but something about his bearing made a few people look twice. Judge Patricia Bennett sat high on her bench, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she flipped through the case file. At 45, she had earned a reputation for being strict and sometimes unnecessarily harsh with traffic offenders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her black robe seemed to amplify her air of authority. As Harold approached the defendant's podium, Judge Bennett barely looked up from her papers. When she did, a slight smirk played across her features. The kind of smirk that suggested she'd seen thousands of cases like this before and had already made up her mind. "Mr. Washington," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "I see here you were caught doing 65 in a 45 zone on Madison Avenue, near the elementary school, no less." She peered at him over her glasses. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" The courtroom had grown quieter, as it usually did when Judge Bennett began one of her famous lectures. A few regular courthouse employees exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this scene play out countless times before. "Your Honor," Harold began in a clear, steady voice, "I can explain the circumstances." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Judge Bennett interrupted, her smile growing more patronizing. "Let me guess. You didn't see the speed limit sign, or perhaps your speedometer isn't working properly." She let out a small laugh that caused several people in the gallery to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Harold remained standing straight, his expression unchanged. The sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the lines on his face, lines that spoke of years of experience and wisdom that the judge seemed determined to ignore. "The thing is, Mr. Washington," she continued, shuffling some papers on her desk, "at your age, you should know better. We see far too many elderly drivers who probably shouldn't be on the road anymore. Perhaps this is a sign that it's time to reconsider your driving privileges." A young lawyer sitting in the front row winced at the judge's words. The court clerk stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she glanced uncertainly between the judge and the elderly defendant. Harold's expression remained remarkably composed, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger or hurt, but a quiet determination that seemed to make him stand even straighter. Judge Bennett was about to continue her lecture when she noticed something unusual. Despite her harsh words and condescending tone, the man before her showed no signs of intimidation or distress. Instead, he maintained eye contact with a confidence that seemed increasingly out of place for someone in his position. The morning sun had risen higher now, and the shadows in the courtroom had shifted. The light fell directly on Harold's face, highlighting a subtle half-smile that hadn't been there before. His hand moved slowly toward the inside pocket of his well-worn suit jacket. Nobody in the courtroom, least of all Judge Patricia Bennett, could have predicted what was about to happen next. The simple traffic violation case was about to take a turn that would leave everyone, especially the smirking judge, completely speechless. The tension in courtroom 7B grew thicker as Harold Washington stood calmly before Judge Bennett. The morning had started like any other, but something in the air had changed. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had died down to complete silence. "Mr. Washington," Judge Bennett continued, her voice carrying a hint of irritation at his composure, "perhaps you don't understand the seriousness of this violation. Speeding in a school zone isn't just breaking the law, it puts children's lives at risk. A young mother in the gallery pulled her child closer, looking at Harold with disapproval. The judge noticed this and seemed to feed off it, straightening her posture even more as she prepared to deliver another lecture. Your Honor, Harold spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several people lean forward in their seats. I understand completely the seriousness of speed limits, especially in school zones. However, Judge Bennett cut him off again, raising her eyebrows. There is no however when it comes to children's safety, Mr. Washington. Your generation might have grown up with different rules, but times have changed. The bailiff, a veteran officer named Mike Thompson, watched the exchange with growing discomfort. In his 15 years of service, he had developed a keen sense for reading people, and something about the elderly man's demeanor didn't fit the typical profile of a traffic violator. Harold's hands remained steady as they rested on the podium. His eyes, sharp and clear, never wavered from the judge's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried decades of experience in every word. Your Honor, with all due respect, my generation understood responsibility far better than you might think. We also understood the importance of allowing people to explain themselves before making judgments. A few gasps echoed through the courtroom. Nobody spoke to Judge Bennett this way, not lawyers, not cops, and certainly not elderly traffic violators. The judge's face flushed red. Mr. Washington, are you suggesting that I'm not allowing you to explain yourself, because from where I sit, you're showing a remarkable lack of respect for this court? On the contrary, Your Honor, Harold replied, I have the utmost respect for this court and what it represents. That's precisely why I'm standing here today instead of handling this matter through other channels. Something in his tone made Judge Bennett pause. For the first time that morning, she actually looked at the man standing before her, really looked at him. Beyond the weathered suit and aged face, there was something in his bearing that seemed oddly familiar, like someone she'd seen in history books or government photographs. The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier condescension had given way to an undercurrent of curiosity. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers suspended above the keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. Other channels? Judge Bennett's voice had lost some of its edge. What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Washington? Harold's hand moved again toward his jacket pocket, this time with purpose. The bailiff instinctively took a step forward, but something in Harold's slight smile made him halt. Your Honor, Harold said, before we continue, I believe it's important to establish some context about why I was on Madison Avenue that day. It involves matters that I'd rather not discuss in an open courtroom. Judge Bennett leaned forward, her curiosity now fully piqued. Mr. Washington, this is a simple traffic violation. What possible context could change the fact that you were speeding in a school zone? Sometimes, Your Honor, Harold replied, his hand now reaching inside his jacket, the simplest things can have the most complex explanations. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, casting a spotlight on the unfolding drama. Judge Bennett's earlier smugness had completely vanished, replaced by a growing uncertainty about the man standing before her. As Harold slowly withdrew something from his jacket, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Nobody could have guessed that the next few moments would completely transform what had started as a routine traffic court session into one of the most memorable days in the courthouse's history. The stage was set for a revelation that would wipe the condescending smile off Judge Bennett's face forever. The leather wallet in Harold Washington's hand looked ordinary enough at first glance. Well worn at the edges, it was the kind of wallet that had seen decades of use. But as his weathered fingers moved to open it, there was something deliberate and almost ceremonial about his movements. Judge Bennett watched with poorly concealed impatience. She had seen countless defendants pull out various forms of identification, usually accompanied by excuses about why they were speeding. Her fingers drummed lightly on her desk, a habit she had developed over years of listening to what she considered pointless explanations. Your Honor, Harold spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Before I show you this, I want to be clear that what follows this moment will require certain protocols to be followed. The bailiff, Mike Thompson, had moved closer to the bench. His years of experience told him something unusual was about to happen. The way Harold held himself, the careful choice of words, none of it fit the profile of a typical traffic offender. Protocols? Judge Bennett's voice carried a mix of confusion and annoyance. "Mr. Washington, this is a traffic court, not a military tribunal. Whatever you're about to show me." Her words died in her throat as Harold opened the wallet, revealing something that made her eyes widen. The morning sunlight caught the edge of a metallic badge. But it wasn't the badge that caused the color to drain from the judge's face. It was the identification card beside it. The court clerk leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look. From where she sat, she could only see the back of the wallet. But the reaction it produced in Judge Bennett was unlike anything she had witnessed in her 12 years at the courthouse. Harold's voice remained steady as he spoke again. "Your Honor, I believe we need to clear the courtroom for the next part of this discussion." Judge Bennett's hand, which had been reaching for her gavel, froze in midair. Her eyes darted between the wallet and Harold's face, seeing him properly for the first time. The weathered suit, the careful posture, the quiet authority in his voice, everything suddenly took on a new meaning. She started, then cleared her throat. "Yes, of course. Bailiff Thompson, please clear the courtroom." The spectators in the gallery began murmuring as Thompson moved to escort them out. Some tried to linger, curious about what could have caused such a dramatic shift in the judge's demeanor. The bailiff's firm guidance left no room for argument. As the last civilian left the courtroom, Harold carefully placed his wallet on the judge's bench. The identification card inside bore the unmistakable seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, but it was the classification level and clearance codes that made Judge Bennett's hands tremble slightly as she reached for her reading glasses. The court reporter, who had begun gathering her things to leave, paused when Harold gestured for her to stay. "Ma'am, please remain. We'll need an official record of what follows, though some portions will be redacted." Judge Bennett had found her voice again, but it had lost all traces of its earlier condescension. "Mr. Washington, I had no idea. But surely this could have been handled through proper channels rather than appearing in traffic court." Harold's slight smile returned. "Sometimes, Your Honor, the most effective way to handle a situation is to let it play out naturally. Besides," he added, glancing at the identification still lying on her bench, "what you're looking at is only the beginning of this story." The heavy doors of courtroom 7B closed with a final thud, sealing off the remaining occupants from the curious onlookers in the hallway. Through the frosted glass, shadows moved as people strained to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. The morning sun had reached its peak, casting sharp shadows across the now empty gallery. In the quiet of the cleared courtroom, Judge Patricia Bennett found herself facing something she had never expected in her 15 years on the bench, a moment where her authority and assumptions were about to be completely upended. Harold Washington stood patiently, waiting for the judge to finish examining his credentials. What would follow would change not only the course of a simple traffic violation, but also Judge Bennett's entire perspective on making assumptions about the people who appeared before her. The cleared courtroom felt larger now, its high ceilings and wooden panels seeming to amplify the silence. Judge Bennett held Harold Washington's CIA credentials in hands that she struggled to keep steady, her eyes moving across each line of text with growing astonishment. 43 years of service, she read aloud, almost whispering. Senior Intelligence Officer, Special Activities Division. Her eyes flickered to Harold's face, seeing past the aged exterior to glimpse the man who had spent decades in the shadows of national security. Harold stood patiently, his posture relaxed but alert. "Yes, Your Honor. Though I'm technically semi-retired now, I still consult on certain sensitive matters." The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, uncertain about what she should record. Harold noticed her hesitation and turned slightly in her direction. "Ma'am, please note that this portion of the transcript will require Level 4 security clearance for access," he said kindly. The reporter nodded, her fingers beginning to move again with renewed purpose. Judge Bennett carefully placed the credentials back on her bench. "Mr. Washington, the record here is extraordinary. But I still don't understand why you were speeding in a school zone at 9:30 in the morning." Harold's expression grew serious. "Your Honor, at 9:17 a.m. on the morning in question, I received an urgent communication regarding a person of interest who had been spotted near Madison Elementary School. This individual was believed to be carrying sensitive materials that could compromise ongoing operations in 3 countries. The bailiff, still standing at attention near the bench, shifted slightly. His hand unconsciously moved closer to his weapon as Harold continued speaking. I was the nearest available operative with the necessary clearance level to intercept and identify this person, Harold explained. The speed at which I was traveling was calculated to minimize risk while ensuring I could maintain visual contact with the target. Judge Bennett's face had lost all traces of its earlier condescension. Was the situation resolved? A slight smile crossed Harold's face. Yes, Your Honor. The individual was indeed carrying classified materials, but they were recovered before any compromise occurred. The details, of course, remain classified. The judge glanced down at her original case notes, the routine traffic violation now seeming almost absurd in context. Her earlier comments about elderly drivers and Harold's generation echoed uncomfortably in her memory. Mr. Washington, she began, her voice carrying a new note of respect, I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was unnecessary. Harold finished for her, his tone gentle but firm, but understandable, given the limited information you had. However, Your Honor, this incident does highlight a larger issue about assumptions and prejudices that I believe deserves attention. The sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows had shifted, creating a pattern of light and shadow across the judge's bench. In that moment, Judge Bennett looked smaller somehow, her previous authority diminished by the weight of her own biases. The court reporter continued typing, her fingers moving swiftly across the keys as she documented this extraordinary turn of events. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases come through this courtroom, stood transfixed by the unfolding scene. Your record indicates numerous commendations, Judge Bennett said, reading further from the credentials, including the Intelligence Star and the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal. She paused, looking up at Harold with new understanding. These are among the highest honors in the intelligence community. Harold nodded modestly. They represent years of service that I can't discuss, Your Honor, but they also represent something else, the fact that dedication, capability, and worth aren't limited by age or appearance. The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Judge Bennett's earlier laughter and dismissive comments now seemed not just inappropriate but painfully shameful. The case is dismissed, Mr. Washington, she said quietly, and again, I apologize for my behavior. Harold reached for his credentials, tucking them carefully back into his jacket pocket. Thank you, Your Honor. Though if I might make a suggestion, perhaps this experience could serve as a catalyst for some changes in how this court operates. The morning sun had reached its zenith outside, but inside courtroom 7B, a different kind of illumination was taking place, one that would have lasting effects on everyone present, especially Judge Patricia Bennett. Judge Patricia Bennett sat in her chambers during the court's lunch recess, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The morning's events played over and over in her mind, each replay making her sink lower in her leather chair. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking time as she reflected on her behavior in the courtroom. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by a deep sense of shame and professional embarrassment. Patricia. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Judge Michael Rodriguez, her mentor from when she'd first joined the bench. I heard about what happened this morning. Want to talk about it? She gestured for him to enter, grateful for a friendly face. Michael, I made such a fool of myself. The things I said to him. The way I laughed. She shook her head, unable to finish. Judge Rodriguez settled into the chair across from her desk. I've known Harold Washington for years, he said quietly. Never knew exactly what he did, of course, but I've seen him at various government functions. The man's a legend in certain circles. Why didn't someone warn me? She asked, pushing away her cold coffee. Would it have made a difference? Rodriguez's question hung in the air, or would you have treated him with respect simply because of his credentials, rather than because he deserved it as a human being appearing in your court? The truth of his words hit her hard. In the adjacent courtroom, the usual sounds of the afternoon session could be heard through the walls, but here in her chambers, Judge Bennett was facing the hardest case of her career, the case against her own prejudices. I keep thinking about all the other people who've stood before me, she admitted. How many times have I made snap judgments? How many times have I let my assumptions about someone's age, race, or appearance influence my behavior? Rodriguez leaned forward. The real question is, what are you going to do about it now? Before she could answer, her clerk appeared at the door with a folder. "Your Honor, I have some information you requested about Mr. Washington's public service record, the unclassified portions, at least." Judge Bennett took the folder with slightly trembling hands. Opening it, she found newspaper clippings dating back decades, heavily redacted government documents, and citations for community service that painted a picture of a life dedicated to others. "He served on the board of 3 children's charities," she read aloud. "Started a mentoring program for at-risk youth, and," she paused, her voice catching, "established a scholarship fund for minority students interested in public service." Rodriguez watched as his colleague absorbed the information. "The man you laughed at this morning has probably done more for this community than most of us will do in our lifetimes." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk as Judge Bennett closed the folder. Her court session would resume in 30 minutes, but she knew something had to change first. "I need to make this right," she said firmly. "Not just with Mr. Washington, but with everyone who comes into my courtroom." "What are you thinking?" Rodriguez asked, recognizing the determined look in her eyes. She stood up, straightening her robes. "First, I'm going to implement mandatory bias training for all court staff, starting with myself. Then, I'm going to establish new guidelines for how we conduct proceedings, ensuring everyone is treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or circumstances." Her clerk, still standing at the door, began taking notes. "And Mr. Washington?" Rodriguez prompted. Judge Bennett picked up her phone. "I'm going to ask him to help us design these new protocols. His perspective would be invaluable, and after how I treated him." She paused, remembering his dignified composure in the face of her disrespect. "Well, I can't think of anyone better to teach us about looking past our preconceptions." The courthouse bells chimed, signaling the approach of the afternoon session. Judge Bennett straightened her spine, feeling the weight of her position differently now. "The funny thing is," she said to Rodriguez as he stood to leave, "I've always prided myself on being fair and impartial. It took an elderly man with a CIA badge to show me how far I still have to go." As she prepared to return to her courtroom, Judge Bennett knew that while this morning had been one of her most humbling experiences, it might also prove to be one of her most important lessons in justice. As news of the morning's events spread through the courthouse, pieces of Harold Washington's remarkable history began to emerge. Court Clerk Jenny Martinez spent her afternoon break in the county records room, piecing together the public aspects of this extraordinary man's life. The story she uncovered read like a chapter from a history book. Born in 1952 in a small town in Georgia, Harold had grown up during the height of the civil rights movement. Despite the challenges of the era, he had graduated top of his class from Howard University in 1974, immediately catching the attention of government recruiters. "Look at this," Jenny whispered to her colleague, pointing at an old newspaper clipping. The yellowed paper showed a young Harold Washington receiving a Community Service Award in 1975, though the details of his service were conspicuously vague. The courthouse security guard, Bill Peters, had his own story to share during the afternoon coffee break. "My father served in Vietnam with Mr. Washington," he told the gathered staff. "Never knew exactly what unit. Dad couldn't talk about it. But he always said if it wasn't for Harold Washington, you wouldn't have made it home." In Judge Bennett's chambers, more official documents painted a broader picture. Harold's career had spanned some of the most crucial moments in modern American history. His name appeared in heavily redacted files from the Cold War era with just enough visible text to hint at his involvement in critical operations. During the fall of the Berlin Wall, re one partially declassified document, Agent Washington's actions were instrumental in. The rest was blacked out, but the presidential commendation that followed spoke volumes. The courthouse historian, Dr. Sarah Chen, discovered records of Harold's quiet contributions to the local community. Between classified missions, he had somehow found time to establish mentoring programs for underprivileged youth. 3 successful charter schools in low-income neighborhoods bore the subtle marks of his influence, though his name appeared on no official documents. He created a scholarship foundation in 1990, Dr. Chen explained to the curious courthouse staff. It's helped over 300 minority students attend college. Most of them went on to public service careers. As the afternoon wore on, more details surfaced. Harold's work hadn't stopped with retirement. Even in his 70s, he continued to consult on matters of national security. His expertise was particularly valued in situations requiring delicate handling and years of experience. The bailiff, Mike Thompson, remembered something as he watched people piece together Harold's history. About 5 years ago, he shared, there was a situation at the federal building downtown. Never made the news, but I was on duty. Mr. Washington walked in, showed some kind of badge, and 30 minutes later, whatever crisis they had was resolved. Never seen anything like it. In the law library, legal intern Kevin Park discovered academic papers Harold had published under various pseudonyms, brilliant analyses of international relations and security protocols. The writing style was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. His work on diplomatic negotiations during crisis situations is still taught at Georgetown. Kevin explained to anyone who would listen. We studied one of his cases last semester, though his name was never mentioned. Judge Rodriguez, who had known Harold peripherally for years, finally felt free to share some less classified memories. I remember during the flood of '98, he told Judge Bennett. Harold coordinated with federal agencies to get relief supplies here before the Red Cross could even mobilize. Never took an ounce of credit. As the day progressed, a fuller picture emerged of a man who had served his country in shadows but had never sought recognition or praise. Harold Washington had moved through some of history's most crucial moments like a ghost, leaving only the faintest traces of his presence but profound impacts in his wake. The courthouse staff found themselves looking at the old photos and documents with a mix of awe and regret. Awe at the remarkable life they revealed, and regret for all the times they might have dismissed or underestimated someone based on appearance alone. By late afternoon, Harold Washington's file had grown thick with discovered documents and shared stories. Yet everyone understood that what they had uncovered was merely the tip of the iceberg, the small portion of his life's work that could be publicly known. In Judge Bennett's courtroom, the chair where Harold had stood that morning had been quietly marked with a small brass plaque. It would serve as a permanent reminder that extraordinary people could appear in the most ordinary circumstances, and that dignity and respect should be extended to everyone who entered those doors. The next morning dawned differently at the Franklin County Courthouse. The usual bustle of early court preparations was accompanied by whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Word of the previous day's events had spread rapidly through the legal community. Judge Patricia Bennett arrived earlier than usual, her usual confident stride replaced by a more thoughtful pace. As she walked through the security checkpoint, she noticed the guards treated every elderly visitor with a new level of respect, helping them with their belongings and offering patient assistance. "Good morning, Your Honor," said Officer James at security. "Mr. Washington called earlier. He's coming in to help with that new training program you proposed." The judge nodded, her throat tight. After yesterday's revelation, Harold had agreed to assist in developing a comprehensive anti-bias training program for the entire courthouse staff. His only condition had been that his full background remain confidential. In the main lobby, a small crowd had gathered around the courthouse bulletin board. Posted there was a new memorandum outlining changes to court procedures, emphasizing respectful treatment of all individuals regardless of appearance or circumstances. Judge Bennett's signature at the bottom was accompanied by a simple note, "Inspired by wisdom received in courtroom 7B." At precisely 9:00 a.m., Harold Washington walked through the courthouse doors. Gone was the weathered suit from yesterday, replaced by a crisp navy blazer and matching trousers. He carried a worn leather briefcase that had probably seen more of the world's secrets than most government archives. The reaction to his entrance was subtle but significant. Security guards straightened their postures. Clerks nodded respectfully. Young lawyers who had heard the story stepped aside to let him pass, their expressions a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Mr. Washington," Judge Bennett greeted him at her chamber doors. "Thank you for coming." Her voice carried none of yesterday's condescension, replaced instead by genuine respect. The morning's meeting included the chief judge, several court administrators, and representatives from the local bar association. As Harold shared his thoughts on improving court procedures, his wisdom extended far beyond matters of bias. "The true measure of justice," he explained to the attentive room, "isn't just in our rulings, but in how we treat every person who walks through these doors. Each one carries a story we can't fully know." In the courthouse cafeteria during lunch, conversations buzzed with new perspectives. A young prosecutor was overheard telling her colleagues, "My grandmother is about his age. I always thought she just played bingo, but now I'm wondering what stories she hasn't told us." The afternoon brought an unexpected visit from the state's Chief Justice, who had heard about the previous day's events. As he and Harold spoke quietly in a corner of the library, the conversation seemed to carry the weight of decades of public service. Judge Bennett spent her afternoon sessions viewing her courtroom differently. She took time to listen more carefully, to look past first impressions, and to consider the unknown stories that might lie behind each face before her. By day's end, Harold's influence had already begun to create visible changes. The courthouse staff moved with more consideration, treated visitors with more patience, and seemed to understand that appearances could be deceiving. As Harold prepared to leave, he paused in Judge Bennett's doorway. "You know," he said with a slight smile, "yesterday's traffic stop may have been one of my most important missions yet." The judge looked up from her desk, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "It certainly was for me, Mr. Washington. It certainly was for me." Outside the courthouse, the setting sun cast long shadows across the steps. As Harold descended, several young law clerks hurried to open the door for him. A police officer on the street corner snapped to attention as he passed. But perhaps the most significant change was invisible to the eye. In courtrooms, offices, and corridors throughout the building, people began to look at each other differently, wondering what hidden stories, what secret heroism, what quiet dignity might lie behind each face they encountered. The day ended with Judge Bennett sitting alone in her chambers, making one final edit to the court's new procedural guidelines. At the top of the document, she added a simple quote: "Justice sees no age, race, or appearance. It sees only the humanity we all share." As she gathered her things to leave, she glanced at the chair where Harold had sat during their meeting. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. 1 month after the memorable day in courtroom 7B, the Franklin County Courthouse had undergone a remarkable transformation. The changes weren't visible in the building's structure or its daily operations, rather in the hearts and minds of those who worked there. Judge Patricia Bennett stood at her chamber window, watching the morning crowd file through the courthouse doors. Her eyes lingered on an elderly woman helping a young mother with her stroller, and she smiled, remembering how one morning had changed her entire perspective. The new training program, developed with Harold Washington's guidance, had been implemented across all departments. Court officers, clerks, judges, and staff had participated in sessions that went far beyond typical sensitivity training. Harold's insights had helped create something truly transformative. "Your Honor," her clerk appeared at the door. "The quarterly report you asked for is ready." She handed over a folder containing statistics from the past month. The numbers told an impressive story. Civilian complaints were down by 60%, case satisfaction rates had improved, and the courthouse had become a model for other districts. In the main lobby, a small plaque had been installed. It didn't mention Harold Washington by name, he had insisted on that, but its message captured his impact. "Look beneath the surface. Every person carries a story worthy of respect." The morning's cases proceeded differently now. Judge Bennett watched as her colleagues took time to truly listen to each person who appeared before them. The rushed atmosphere that had once dominated the courthouse had been replaced by one of patient understanding. During the lunch break, a group of law students toured the courthouse. Their guide, pointing to courtroom 7B, shared a carefully edited version of what had happened there. "This is where we learned our most important lesson about judgment," she explained. "Not the legal kind, but the human kind." Harold himself had become something of a quiet legend. He still consulted for the courthouse's training program, though he declined all attempts to publicly recognize his contributions. His CIA work continued as well, though now the security guards smiled knowingly when he passed through with his familiar leather briefcase. In the afternoon, Judge Bennett presided over a traffic court session, her first since that fateful day. As each case came before her, she took time to listen, to understand, to look past the immediate circumstances to the human being standing at the podium. "You've changed," Judge Rodriguez commented during their afternoon coffee break. "The whole courthouse has changed, but you most of all." She nodded, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I learned that wisdom doesn't always come in the packages we expect. Sometimes it comes in a weathered suit, carrying a CIA badge." The day's final hours brought a surprise visit from Harold. He moved through the courthouse quietly, nodding to familiar faces, but stopped at Judge Bennett's chambers. "I'm retiring for real this time," he announced with a smile. The CIA finally convinced me to write my memoirs, the declassified version, of course. Judge Bennett stood to shake his hand. Will you mention us? She asked. Just a chapter about how justice works in unexpected ways, he replied. And how sometimes being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. As the sun set on another day at the Franklin County Courthouse, its shadows fell across a changed institution. The building remained the same, but the people inside had learned to see beyond appearances, to listen more carefully, to judge more wisely. In her final act before leaving for the day, Judge Bennett added a personal note to her bench book, a reminder for herself and future judges who would sit in courtroom 7B. Look for the extraordinary in the ordinary. It's always there, waiting to be discovered. Outside, Harold Washington walked down the courthouse steps one last time. A young security guard rushed to help him with his briefcase, but Harold politely declined. Some habits, formed over decades of self-reliance, die hard. As he reached the street, he turned back to look at the building where one traffic ticket had sparked a revolution of perspective. The setting sun gilded the courthouse windows, making them shine like gold, a fitting tribute to the changes that had taken place within. The lesson of Harold Washington lived on in every courtroom, every corridor, and every interaction. It was a lesson about looking past the surface, about finding dignity in unexpected places, and about the wisdom that comes from learning to see people, truly see them, for who they are.